I had already faced many stormy nights working as a forest ranger, and that night didn't seem different from countless others. But everything changed after I received that emergency call. To this day, what happened in that cabin remains etched in my memory, and the terror I felt that night is something I'll never forget. My name is Luke, and I've been working as a forest ranger for 15 years. Most of the time, it's a solitary job, and for me, that's never been a problem. I've always enjoyed the calm and tranquility of the forests, especially at night. The absolute silence, interrupted only by the sounds of animals or the wind rustling through the leaves, was almost therapeutic. Many people avoid this kind of job, preferring the hustle of the city and the constant company of others. But I've always preferred solitude. It was there, in the heart of the wilderness, that I felt truly alive. That night, my shift began like any other. The rain fell steadily, but not enough to worry me. The patrol cabin where I was stationed was small, but it provided shelter from the elements. I sat at the weathered wooden table, organizing reports and checking the routine messages on the radio. The radio was my connection to the outside world, and even though it was silent most of the time, I always kept it on. I knew that, at any moment, it could be my only resource in a critical situation. The hours dragged on slowly, and everything pointed to another quiet night. The rain intensified outside, but the sound of raindrops hitting the roof was oddly comforting. The wind began to howl through the trees, yet still, nothing out of the ordinary. I was prepared for a few more hours of calm. But then, as I was lost in thought, the radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. The noise made me snap my head up, tension filling the air. Emergency call. Attention, Ranger Luke. A group of campers is missing in the mountains. I repeat, a group of campers has gone missing in the nearby mountains. Severe storm forecasted, urgent search requested after weather improves. The voice on the radio was choppy, but the message was clear. A disappearance during a storm was always cause for concern. Immediately, a chill ran down my spine. What had seemed like an ordinary night was about to turn into something much darker. I looked at the radio, sensing that what was coming would be unlike anything I had ever faced. After receiving the emergency call, I knew I had to prepare for the worst. The weather was already closing in, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I always kept an emergency kit ready for situations like this. Detailed maps of the area, flashlights, ropes, and a backup radio. However, the intensity of the rain outside was starting to worry me. I tried to establish contact with the campers, but the radio only emitted static. The signal was probably poor due to the weather conditions. This meant that, at least for now, they were completely out of reach. I looked out the window, watching the trees bend under the force of the wind. The rain hammered against the glass, creating a constant, unsettling sound. I knew going out at that moment would be risky, so I decided to wait until the storm eased up before beginning any search. Even so, the sense of urgency was growing inside me. Something about this situation felt different, darker. It wasn't unusual for campers to get lost on trails during storms, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play that night. That's when I remembered the old observation cabin at the top of the mountain, a place I had used on previous occasions. I knew that from there, I'd have a better view of the area, and it would also serve as a safer shelter if the storm worsened. I decided that as soon as the rain let up, I would head there. With the radio out and no other information about the campers, it was the only plan that seemed feasible. I checked my gear again, making sure I was ready for anything. As I waited, the patrol cabin felt increasingly claustrophobic. The sound of the wind was intensifying, like something was being dragged outside. The feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. The sudden silence between gusts of wind felt almost as eerie as the constant noise. Even though I knew it was just the storm outside, something told me I wasn't alone. It was an irrational feeling, but impossible to ignore. The night was just beginning, and I could already feel the weight of the unknown. Finally, after a long wait, the rain eased up a bit. This was my chance to move. I grabbed my backpack, adjusted the radio in search of a signal, and left the cabin with a flashlight in hand. The wind was still strong, and I'd have to be quick to reach the old cabin before the storm returned in full force. I knew every minute counted, and the darkness was starting to swallow the forest around me. The hike to the observation cabin wouldn't be easy, especially with the wet ground and the wind trying to knock me down at every step. The trail was familiar to me, but that night, everything felt different. The trees, normally silent and harmless, seemed to twist menacingly. I moved cautiously, using the flashlight to illuminate the path ahead, but the light flickered with the wind and the rain that was starting to pick up again. Every sound around me seemed amplified, only adding to my growing sense of unease. When I finally spotted the observation cabin, I felt a brief sense of relief. It was there, just as I remembered it, a sturdy and simple structure built to withstand storms like this one. I approached quickly and entered, closing the door with a thud that echoed through the small space. Inside, the sound of the storm was muffled, but something about the atmosphere remained heavy. It was as if the cabin itself was charged with a strange energy, as if it knew I was being watched. As I settled inside the cabin, I noticed something that made me uneasy. On the floor, there were fresh footprints, partially covered in mud. They led to the door of the cabin, as if someone had been there just before I arrived. I looked around, but there was no sign of another person. My heart raced. I was the only ranger assigned to that area, and no one else should have been nearby. With the campers missing and the violent storm, who else could be moving around out there? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could have been a visitor who passed through the cabin before the storm worsened. But the logic didn't comfort me. The presence of those footprints was too unsettling to ignore. With the radio still silent and no signal of communication, I found myself isolated in that cabin with the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The night was far from over, and that sense of being watched didn't seem like it would go away anytime soon. I decided not to leave the cabin until dawn. Even if the group of campers was out there somewhere, the storm and darkness made any search impossible. The only thing I could do was wait. But as the rain continued to beat against the wooden walls and the wind howled outside, the sound of something moving slowly on the porch of the cabin made me question if waiting was really the best option. Inside the cabin, time seemed to drag on. The constant sound of rain against the wooden walls and the wind howling outside created a disturbing atmosphere. The footprints in the mud were still on my mind, a constant reminder that something strange was happening. I tried not to think about the fact that I was alone in that forest, without communication, and with the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby. Every noise outside seemed amplified, as if the storm was whispering dark secrets. Then, the cabin lights flickered once, twice, 3 times before going out completely. I was left in the dark, with only my flashlight as a source of light. The observation cabin, which normally gave me a sense of security, now felt like a trap. The heavy silence of the power outage deepened the feeling of isolation. Being in the dark, surrounded by the storm, only intensified my sense of vulnerability. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it around the inside of the cabin, trying to see if anything was out of place. The noises outside grew louder. They weren't just the sounds of rain or wind. There were footsteps, slowly, circling the cabin, as if whoever it was deliberately moving around. Each step sounded calculated, as if they were stalking me. I cautiously approached the window, trying to peer outside. The rain streamed down the glass, making it hard to see, but I knew there was something or someone out there. The flashlight in my hand trembled a bit as I shone it outside, but I saw nothing beyond the shadows of the trees dancing in the storm. Time seemed to freeze as the tension mounted. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable, but who or what was out there? I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself and think rationally. Maybe it was just an animal, or someone seeking shelter from the storm. But then, I heard the sound of something being dragged across the porch of the cabin. It was a dry, heavy sound, as if something was being moved slowly over the wood. My body tensed, my heart racing. The only thing I could do was wait and try to stay in control. The feeling of being watched, of being the target of something invisible, was becoming unbearable. I decided that if the noises continued, I would have to go out and investigate, but I knew it would be risky. For now, the only thing left to do was keep watching, hoping the storm, or whatever was out there, would pass. I didn't know how much time had passed since the lights went out and the disturbing silence took over the cabin. The sound of the storm still raged outside, but it was what I couldn't see that made me uneasy. Then, something happened that made my blood run cold. A loud, dry sound struck against the window, as if someone or something was knocking. My heart raced, and instinctively, I pointed the flashlight toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving. With slow, cautious steps, I approached the window. Each of my movements seemed to echo through the room, the sound of my own footsteps louder than normal. When I reached the window and shone the light outside, I saw it. In the rain, a few meters from the cabin, there was a motionless figure. It was hard to make out any details because of the heavy rain, but I could see someone standing there, staring directly at the cabin. The feeling of being watched was replaced by a certainty. I was not alone that night. For a few seconds, I was paralyzed, unsure of how to react. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, static, as if waiting for something from me. My instinct told me to do something, but there was no logic to what was happening. Who would be out there in the middle of a storm? And why? Before I could make any decision, the figure vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness and the rain. There was no sound, no sudden movement. One second it was there, and the next, it simply wasn't anymore. I tried to process what I had just seen. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Could it have been the exhaustion, the isolation, or the fear taking over? There was no way to be sure. But one thing was clear. Something was wrong, and I could no longer ignore the signs. I ran to the cabin door, gripping the flashlight tightly, determined to investigate, but I hesitated before opening it. What if it was dangerous? What if that figure was watching me, waiting for me to do just that? The dilemma consumed me for a few moments until I decided not to take the risk. I retreated inside and locked the door, trying to control my breathing. Now, in addition to the storm outside, there was something much more disturbing going on, and I didn't know what to expect next. No matter how much my mind tried to find a rational explanation for what I had seen, everything led me back to that figure. I knew I wasn't imagining things, but I couldn't understand why someone would be out there on a night like that. I grabbed the radio again, trying to make contact with the campers or the base, but the signal was still cut off. It was as if the storm was blocking any chance of communication. This only made me feel more isolated, more vulnerable. The noise outside didn't stop. Now, in addition to the rain and wind, there were strange sounds, as if something was moving in circles around the cabin. Footsteps, heavy steps, followed by long periods of silence. I knew something was out there, but whenever I tried to look out the window or went outside with the flashlight, I found nothing. It was as if that figure was toying with me, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. The feeling of being hunted increased with every passing minute. I decided I needed to take action. I couldn't stay in the cabin, just waiting, doing nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped out the door, illuminating every corner around me. The rain was falling hard, and my visibility was limited. The biting cold made my muscles tense, but I had to figure out what was going on. I followed the footsteps circling the cabin, trying to track any sign of the figure. But, just like before, they disappeared suddenly, leading nowhere. It was as if whoever was making them knew exactly how to avoid being found. I returned to the cabin, frustrated and tired. But then I realized something had changed. As I entered, I saw that in the middle of the room, there was a series of objects that hadn't been there before. A rusty key, an old piece of fabric, and a partially burned map. I knew I hadn't brought those with me, and the idea that the figure could have entered while I was outside filled me with dread. Something or someone was toying with me, and I didn't know why. My only option was to wait until morning. But as the storm roared outside and the silence inside the cabin deepened, I knew the night had much more to reveal. Seeing those objects on the floor made me freeze for a moment. A rusty key, an old piece of cloth, and a partially burned map. None of that should have been there. I knew exactly what I had brought into the cabin, and those items weren't part of my gear. My heart was racing, and the feeling that something or someone had entered the cabin while I was outside overwhelmed me. I began to wonder if, at some point, I had been followed from the start of my patrol. The storm outside, which had seemed like the biggest concern, now became the backdrop to something much more disturbing. I approached the object slowly, shining the flashlight on each detail. The key was old, rusted, as if it had been taken from a long-forgotten place. The fabric seemed to be part of an old garment, tattered and covered in dirt. And the map, something about that map caught my attention. It was partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but the part that remained showed an area near the observation cabin, a trail leading somewhere deep into the forest. But who would have left it there? And why was the map burned? As if they were trying to hide something. My mind was racing, trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle. If someone had left those objects, what did they want from me? Were they trying to scare me or guide me somewhere? The idea that I was being manipulated made me feel even more vulnerable. I grabbed the radio again, trying to contact the base, but nothing but static came from the device. I was completely isolated, with no one to call for help or share what was happening. The night was far from over, and the feeling that I was just a pawn in a larger game wouldn't leave me. As I examined the map more closely, a familiar sound came from outside the cabin. Footsteps. They were back, but this time they were stronger, heavier, as if someone was approaching deliberately. My breath quickened, and my body tensed. I looked toward the door, expecting it to be opened at any moment, but the footsteps continued circling outside, never entering. Whoever it was, they were waiting for something. For me, I gripped the flashlight more tightly, trying to think of what to do next. I needed to be prepared. I knew staying in that cabin much longer wasn't safe, but going out in the middle of the storm, with that figure lurking, was also a risky gamble. The only thing I knew for sure was that the objects left on the floor weren't there by accident. They were a warning, or maybe an invitation. But to where? And why? My mind was full of questions, but time was running out. The night seemed longer than ever, and I knew something big was about to happen. Dawn seemed like a distant, almost unreachable promise. The storm outside raged on, but the footsteps around the cabin were what worried me most. They seemed closer, more insistent, as if the figure was waiting for me to leave or make some move that would reveal my position. I wondered how much longer I could keep my composure. That figure in the window, the objects on the floor, it was as if I was being surrounded, tested, forced to take action. I picked up the burn map and analyzed it one last time. It indicated a specific area in the forest, a trail that seemed to lead to an unknown place. Maybe the figure was guiding me there. Maybe it was a trap. I had no way of knowing, but staying in the cabin waiting didn't seem like a good idea either. The situation had spiraled out of control, and I knew something was about to happen. The question was, should I go to the place marked on the map, or try to survive until dawn? As I pondered my options, something hit the window of the cabin violently. A loud, dry sound, as if someone was trying to get in. I ran to the door, locked all the bolts, and shone the flashlight outside. The figure was no longer there, but I knew I wasn't alone. The footsteps outside became more erratic, as if something was searching for an opening, a way in. My heart was racing, and I knew time was running out. I had to make a decision. Finally, amid the chaos of the night, the sounds outside stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then I saw something new on the cabin floor. A small knife left among the other objects. The blade was dirty, covered in mud and what looked like dried blood. This was the final warning. It was a sign that whoever, or whatever was out there was ready to act. I knew I had no more time to hesitate. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had lessened. I left the cabin cautiously, my eyes scanning the perimeter, looking for any sign of movement. The footprints around the cabin were still there, a reminder that something or someone had been with me all night. The map and the strange objects I found provided no answers, only more questions. I walked to the edge of the forest, the wind still blowing softly. The figure had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched never went away. As I descended the mountain back to the base, I knew that night would stay with me forever. I never found out who or what was out there, and the objects left for me remain a mystery. Perhaps the group of campers never existed. Perhaps it was all part of a twisted game played by someone, or something that lurks in the shadows of the forest. But one thing was certain. That wouldn't be my last encounter with the unknown. I had worked in many underground tunnels during storms, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It all started with a simple maintenance call, but what I experienced in that tunnel will be etched in my mind forever. It was supposed to be just another routine job, but by the end of the night, I knew something far darker was lurking deep beneath the city. My name is Jake, and I've been a maintenance technician for over 10 years. My job involves ensuring that the city's underground systems, including the subway, run smoothly, especially during extreme conditions like storms. I've always enjoyed the hands-on nature of the work, and the darkness of the tunnels never bothered me. To me, the underground was like any other place. The deep silence, the constant hum of machinery, and the feeling of being disconnected from the city above were almost comforting. But that night, everything felt a little different. A severe storm had hit the city, causing floods in several areas, including the subway tunnels. I received an emergency call to investigate a power issue affecting one of the main lines. I left the base with my team, equipped with flashlights, tools, and radios. Everything seemed under control. The plan was simple: fix the problem and get out of there before the situation worsened. The sound of rain pounding against the city streets above echoed through the tunnels, creating a constant, almost hypnotic rhythm. As we descended deeper into the tunnel, the water slowly began to rise, trickling down the sides of the concrete walls. This wasn't unusual during storms, but something about the atmosphere felt different. The dark corridors seemed more oppressive, as if they were slowly closing in on us. The team followed me, each person focused on their task, but I felt a growing unease. With every step we took, the air felt heavier, and the darkness wrapped around us in a way that was hard to ignore. Still, we pressed on. The job had to get done, and this was the kind of situation we dealt with regularly. I tried to focus on the electrical problem we needed to resolve, but something in the back of my mind kept telling me that this night would be different. What I didn't know was that the deeper we ventured into the tunnels, the closer we would get to something we were never meant to find. The environment was already grim, with the dim lighting of the tunnels, but it wasn't until the lights failed completely that the tension really began to rise. We were about halfway to the area we needed to check when, without any warning, all the lights went out at once. I stood still for a moment, waiting for the emergency system to kick in, but nothing happened. Just silence, broken only by the soft sound of water trickling along the sides of the tunnel. It was pitch black, and despite being used to situations like this, a chill ran down my spine. Damn, what happened to the lights? I heard one of my colleagues ask, their voice echoing off the walls. We all turned on our flashlights at the same time, beams of light dancing across the dirty, wet walls. The water continued to slowly rise on the floor, creating small ripples as we moved. The storm outside seemed to be worsening, and now we were completely isolated underground. I tried to contact Central on the radio, but all I got was static. Weak signal down here. I told the group, trying to stay calm. We needed to keep moving, and the control panel we were looking for was still a good walk from where we were. I decided to keep going, leading the group with the flashlight in hand, lighting the way ahead. Let's keep moving. It could be that the blackout affected more areas than we thought. As we ventured deeper into the tunnel, I started to notice something strange. The sound of the water and our footsteps echoed normally, but there was another sound, more subtle, that seemed to surround us. It was almost like a whisper, a muffled sound coming from somewhere farther away. I stayed alert, trying to identify what it was, but I couldn't pinpoint its origin. The storm could have been causing strange noises in the systems, but still, something about that sound didn't feel natural. The team started to notice it too. "Are you guys hearing that?" one of the technicians asked, their beam of light shaking slightly. We all stopped, listening carefully. The tunnel was completely quiet, except for the soft sound of water. "Just the echo of our footsteps," another replied, trying to dismiss the tension. But I knew there was more to it. The sounds coming from the depths of the tunnel had an odd quality, almost human. I tried to push the thought aside, but the feeling that something was watching us slowly took hold. The water was rising, and walking through the tunnels became more difficult. Our boots made wet squishing sounds with every step, and the echo of it bounced off the concrete walls. We knew we couldn't stay there for too long. If the storm continued, the tunnels could fill up quickly. The emergency lights, which would normally turn on automatically in a power failure, stayed off, and that only added to the strangeness of what was happening. We kept moving, each of us focused on our flashlight, when we finally spotted the control panel we needed to check. It was a small metal box fixed to the wall, typically used to monitor the electricity that powers the lighting system. I walked up to it, trying to open the box with the maintenance key. That's when I heard the whispers again. This time, they were closer, as if coming from the shadows just beyond the light of our flashlights. "Did you hear that?" I asked, feeling my heart race. The flashlights turned toward me. Everyone seemed tense, but no one admitted to hearing anything. I kept trying to open the control box, but the persistent sound unnerved me. With every second that passed, the water rose a little higher, soaking the cuffs of my pants. The feeling that something was watching us grew stronger. I forced myself to focus on the task, but my instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. When I finally opened the control panel, everything changed. Instead of finding the usual cables and fuses, I found something unexpected. Inside the box, there were food scraps, torn papers, and what looked like an old, folded mattress at the bottom. I paused for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would be using this place as shelter? And why hide these items in the control panel? I showed the others, and they were just as confused. It didn't make sense. The tunnel was supposed to be empty, and there were no recent signs of human activity except for our own footsteps. Yet someone had clearly been here before us, and that someone didn't seem to want to be found. Discovering that mattress and the food scraps hidden in the control panel wasn't just strange, it was unsettling. There was no explanation for it, at least not one that made sense in the context of where we were. I stared at the objects for a few more seconds, trying to imagine who would have spent so much time down here, in this dark tunnel, without anyone noticing. Who the hell would hide a mattress here? One of the technicians asked, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. No one answered. Silence surrounded us, and the distant sound of the water slowly rising was now almost unbearable. I could feel that we were being watched. And the worst part was that the feeling didn't just come from the discomfort of the environment. There was something more, an invisible presence that seemed to be lurking. I decided it was time to go back. We had found the control panel, and the problem was bigger than we thought. If someone was really living down here in the tunnels, it was possible they had sabotaged the electrical system. We couldn't know for sure, but the idea deeply unsettled me. The walk back seemed endless. The water was higher now, and our steps were heavy, making progress difficult. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something that was never within reach of our flashlights. As we walked, I started to hear the whispers again. This time, they were unmistakable. They came from all directions, blending with the echo of our footsteps. It was as if the tunnel itself was speaking. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. My hands were sweating, and the radio I was holding suddenly emitted a sharp static, breaking the momentary silence. "Jake, are you hearing this?" One of the technicians' voices came nervously through the radio, and I realized he was hearing the whispers too. We all were. The problem was, we couldn't see anyone. The tunnel seemed to have a life of its own, and whoever or whatever was down there with us didn't want to be found. As we moved through the tunnel, something changed. The tension that had hung over us since the start of the mission seemed to grow with each passing minute. The concrete walls, wet and oppressive, seemed to close in around us. The water was now reaching our ankles, and the feeling that something or someone was watching us was unbearable. It was then that I realized I had drifted too far from the team. "Mark? Sarah? Where are you?" I called out over the radio, but static was the only response. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the shadowy corners of the tunnel, trying to spot some sign of the team. The sound of water moving around my feet was unnerving, and the echo of my own footsteps amplified the feeling of isolation. I never should have strayed so far, but the control panel I was checking had led me in another direction. And now, the team seemed too far away for me to reach them quickly. I tried to stay calm, but the fear inside me was growing. As I walked back, the voices that had once been whispers started to grow louder, as if someone was speaking just behind me. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, unsettling. With every step, The feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hands, and my heart raced. I tried not to look behind me, but the curiosity and fear were overwhelming. I took a deep breath and continued along the path that, in theory, should have led me back to the group. But suddenly, I heard footsteps beyond my own. Footsteps that didn't belong to me or anyone on my team. They echoed off the walls, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone was following me from a safe distance, staying in the shadows. I turned around quickly, pointing my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. I knew I needed to find the team, but now the feeling of being followed was stronger than ever. The tunnel seemed to stretch on infinitely, and with every step, I felt more trapped, as if the very structure was conspiring to keep me there. My radio crackled again, and the sound of the footsteps behind me grew quicker, as if something was closing in. The footsteps continued to follow me. Now, they were closer, more insistent. The feeling of being hunted, of being in a trap, overwhelmed me. My breathing was heavy, and every muscle in my body was tense. I was starting to realize that whatever was following me didn't want to be seen, but it wanted me to know it was there. It was as if it was toying with me, coming closer and then retreating whenever I tried to shine my light into the shadows. My mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a lost animal in the tunnels, or someone living down there, like the signs we found in the control panel. But with each step, that explanation seemed less and less likely. The sound of the footsteps was human, but who would be down there, hidden deep in the tunnels, in the middle of a storm, unseen? The water was now even higher, and every movement I made caused splashes that echoed throughout the tunnel. I knew I needed to hurry and find the team before things got worse. As I followed the trail that marked the way back, I saw an elevated point ahead. A small maintenance platform stood out in the darkness. I climbed up with difficulty, feeling the weight of the water soaking my clothes and boots. As soon as I reached the platform, the footsteps behind me stopped. Silence reigned once again, but it was an oppressive silence, heavy with invisible intentions. The echo of water dripping down the walls was the only thing I could hear. I turned on the radio again, hoping to reconnect with my team, but all I received was unrelenting static, almost deafening. It was clear that, for now, I was alone. Then, out of nowhere, a sound emerged from the darkness. It wasn't whispers anymore, nor footsteps. It was a dry sound, like something being dragged across the ground, near the tunnel I had just walked through. My heart raced. Whatever was with me in that place was closer than ever, and now, it seemed determined to reveal itself. I was frozen in place, every cell in my body screaming for me to do something. Run, fight, anything. But fear was paralyzing. The sound of something being dragged continued, louder, more persistent. Something was there with me. But no matter how much I pointed my flashlight at the dark corners of the tunnel, I couldn't see anything. It was as if I was dealing with a ghost, an invisible presence moving with the intention of tormenting me. Finally, I decided to act. I climbed down from the platform and started walking quickly, trying to get away from that sound. But it followed me. With every step I took, the sound seemed closer, more threatening. My heart was pounding, and my hands trembled as I held the flashlight and radio. I knew I needed to find the team. I needed to get out of there. But the way back felt endless, and the feeling of being trapped grew more intense. Then, in the middle of the darkness, I saw something that made me stop. The faint beam of my flashlight illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the tunnel. It was a human silhouette, but it was motionless, as if waiting for me. My blood ran cold. There was no way to tell who it was or what they wanted. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, in the middle of the path. With the flashlight in hand, I slowly approached, keeping a safe distance. But before I could do anything, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. I looked around, shining my light everywhere, but there was nothing. I was alone again, or at least, that's what it seemed. The sound of something being dragged returned, and now, it was right behind me. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Fear took over, and every instinct screamed at me to run. It didn't matter what or who was there. I needed to get out. I started running through the tunnel, the water nearly up to my knees, forcing myself to go faster, to get away from that disturbing sound. The wet walls and the echo of my own footsteps made everything feel even more surreal. My radio, once static, crackled to life. "Jake, can you hear me?" Sarah's voice came through the radio, bringing a brief sense of relief. "Yes. Where are you?" I replied, almost out of breath. "We're heading back. Stay in the main tunnel," she said, the static cutting off part of the message, but enough for me to understand that the team was trying to find me. But would they be quick enough? The sound behind me was now louder, as if something was truly chasing me. I looked back, my flashlight shaking in my hands. I didn't see anything, but I knew it was there. A presence, a shadow, something that had been hunting me since I strayed from the group. I kept running, hearing the sound of the team's footsteps getting closer. I had to reach them. Finally, I saw the beam of light from one of the team's flashlights ahead. I ran with everything I had left, and when I reached them, I almost collapsed with relief. "What happened?" Mark asked, but I could barely respond. I looked back, shining my flashlight into the tunnel, but the figure was gone. "I don't know what it was, but something was following me," I said, still breathless. We decided to leave the tunnels as quickly as possible. And even after we reached the surface, the feeling that something else was down there never left me. Those tunnels held secrets that I would never fully understand. I had faced storms on the road before, but that night was unlike any other. Something about the intensity of the rain, the muffled sound of the thunder, and the complete darkness surrounding me made a sense of dread take hold. It was that night when I stopped at a motel I will never forget, and what I experienced there still gives me chills to this day. My name is Henry, and I'm used to long, solitary journeys. As a sales rep for equipment, I spend most of my time on the road, traveling from one city to another across the country. I enjoy the freedom this job gives me, the sense that the whole world is at my disposal. But that night, as I drove through the torrential storm, all I wanted was to find a place to rest. The road ahead was poorly lit, and my windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the downpour that wouldn't let up. That's when I saw a faint light in the distance. A flickering sign by the side of the road pointed to a motel. It looked old and run down, the kind of place you only stop at as a last resort. But at that moment, my need to get out of the rain outweighed any hesitation. As I parked in front of the building, I felt an unease I couldn't explain. The place was nearly deserted, except for two old cars that looked like they had been there for a long time. The wind howled through the surrounding trees, and the parking lot lamps flickered with each lightning strike. I got out of the car, pulling my hood up, and walked toward the reception. The glass door creaked as it opened, and a small bell rang as I entered. I looked around and didn't see anyone right away, just the muffled sound of the storm outside. The room had a strange aura, as if time had stopped inside that motel. Little did I know, what awaited me that night would change everything. As soon as the bell over the door rang a second time, a man slowly appeared from behind the reception desk. He was thin, pale, and his eyes looked tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was wrinkled and dirty, and he showed no enthusiasm in serving me. Without saying a word, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old key with a room number marked on a worn-out tag. "Room 6, he said in a low, monotonous voice, as if fulfilling a boring obligation. The entire interaction left me uncomfortable, but I was exhausted, and fatigue outweighed my unease. I took the key, paid for the room, and headed down the narrow hallway, barely exchanging any words with the receptionist. As I walked, I noticed the smell of mold in the air. The walls were worn, and the lights above flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to move with each flicker. The place was almost empty, and the sense of isolation grew with every step I took. I reached room 6 and unlocked the door with some difficulty, as if the lock hadn't been used in a long time. When I entered, I was immediately hit by the smell of dust mixed with something metallic. The room was small and basic, with a double bed in the center, an old wardrobe to the side, and a window overlooking the parking lot. The curtains were torn at the edges, and the furniture seemed like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s. Despite the unpleasant vibe, I tossed my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to relax. The rain continued to pound against the window, and the thunder seemed even louder inside the room. As I took off my shoes, I heard something that made me pause for a second. Knocking. It was as if someone was softly tapping at my door. I froze, listening closely. The knocks came again, 3 times, slow and rhythmic. My heart started to race a little. I stood up and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door slowly, expecting to see someone in the empty hallway, but it was completely deserted. I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened, but nothing seemed out of place. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, trying to shake off the discomfort that was growing inside me. The night had just begun, and something told me those knocks wouldn't be the last strange thing I'd face. After locking the door, I went back to the bed, trying to convince myself that the knocking was just the wind or some noise caused by the storm. The rain outside seemed to get stronger, and the thunder made the walls tremble. I looked at the clock on the nightstand, hoping the night would pass quickly, but the minutes seemed to drag on. I lay down, but I hadn't even closed my eyes when another sound startled me. This time, it wasn't knocking on the door. It was at the window. I shot up immediately, my heart pounding again. The window was just a few steps from the bed, and the thin curtains swayed with the wind. I stood there for a moment, waiting to hear the sound again, and it came. 3 knocks, firm but quiet, as if someone was outside, asking to come in. With trembling hands, I slowly pulled the curtain back, revealing the rain-fogged glass. There was no one there. I approached the window, scanning the outside. The parking lot remained empty, except for the same old cars I'd seen before. The wind and rain lashed hard, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. I quickly closed the curtain and turned away, feeling a strange sense of panic begin to set in. Something was definitely wrong with that place. I sat back on the bed, breathing deeply, trying to stay calm, but my mind kept searching for explanations. I started to wonder if those knocks were just my imagination, perhaps amplified by the isolation and the storm outside. The sound of the rain and thunder echoed through everything, and it was possible I was more on edge than I realized. I decided to try and ignore it, even though the idea of being alone in such a strange place deeply unsettled me. I picked up my phone, trying to distract myself, but the signal was weak, almost non-existent. Time passed slowly, and the knocking didn't return, at least for a while. However, the silence that followed didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. It was a dense, heavy silence, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. I remained seated on the edge of the bed, ears attuned to every sound, and that's when I heard it. Whispers. Very faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. They were coming from the hallway, near my door. The whispers were almost impossible to hear at first, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. They weren't distinct voices. They were more like murmurs, as if several people were speaking at once, but muffled. The sound made me uneasy, and a chill ran down my spine. I approached the door, trying to listen more closely, but I hesitated before unlocking it. Something inside me screamed not to touch the lock. I peeked through the crack in the door, spying on the poorly lit hallway of the motel. The lights were still flickering, casting shadows on the walls. Then, I saw them. Shadows, quick and fluid, moving past the rooms. It was as if someone was running back and forth, but there were no footsteps. I stood there, frozen, watching with my heart racing, hoping it was just a trick of the flickering lights, but I knew it wasn't. The shadows were real. I backed away from the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe they were other guests, but the motel had been nearly empty when I arrived. The sense that something more sinister was at play took hold of me. Even so, I decided to carefully open the door and take a look down the hallway. When I did, the hallway was empty. No sound, no shadows. Just the distant echo of the storm outside and the flickering lights above me. I walked slowly down the hallway, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I passed by other rooms and noticed they were all locked. No light came from under the doors, and the room numbers were covered in dust, as if no one had stayed there for a long time. The reception area was also deserted, with no sign of the strange receptionist who had checked me in earlier. The feeling that I was completely alone in the motel grew stronger. I went back to the room, trying to block out the thoughts racing through my mind. I locked the door again and sat on the bed, unsure of what to do next. Silence reigned once more, but now it was more disturbing than before. Something was happening in that place, and I knew I couldn't ignore it for much longer. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway again, but this time, they were closer. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer and closer. Each sound felt like a hammer in my head, and my heart beat in sync with the echo of the steps. I was sitting on the bed, not knowing what to do, just waiting. Something inside me told me not to open the door again, but the curiosity mixed with fear was almost irresistible. I stood up slowly, trying to stay calm, and walked toward the door. I peeked through the crack again, and this time I saw something that made me freeze in place. A shadow, standing at the end of the hallway, motionless. It wasn't just an ordinary shadow. It was dense, like a human figure, but without defined features. I stood there, not breathing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, at the end of the hallway, staring at me. A chill ran down my spine, and sweat started to drip from my hands. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered again, and when they came back, the figure had disappeared. The hallway was empty, but I could still feel its presence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and locked the door again. Now it was clear that whatever was happening there was something beyond what I could comprehend. Maybe I was dealing with something that wasn't of this world, or maybe the isolation and fear were driving me insane. Either way, I knew I couldn't ignore what I had just seen. As I tried to process what was happening, a thought occurred to me. What if I was the only guest in the motel? I decided to check the other rooms. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, I left the room again. I went to the doors of the neighboring rooms and knocked on all of them, but got no answer. I opened a few, and to my surprise, they were all empty, just like the hallway, no sign of life. It was as if the entire motel was there just for me, and that realization made my fear intensify. With my heart racing, I returned to my room, quickly closing the door. I was alone in that place, and I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. But before I could think of a plan, the knocking started again, this time louder and more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the window. The knocking at the window was different from before, louder, more intense, as if something, or someone, was desperate to get in. My body froze with fear for a few moments, and the sound seemed to echo inside my head. The window was covered by the torn curtains, and even though I knew I shouldn't, I felt an almost irresistible urge to look. The silence that followed the knocking only increased my anxiety, as if time itself was waiting for my next move. With my heart pounding in my chest, I took a step toward the window. My trembling hand touched the curtain, but before I could open it, the sound of footsteps returned in the hallway. This time, they were fast, and there weren't just one or two sets. It sounded like several people running back and forth, their steps echoing through the thin walls of the motel. The hallway, which had been empty, now seemed full of life, or something like it. It was impossible that all those empty rooms were hiding so many people, but the sound of footsteps said otherwise. Ignoring the window, I ran to the door and looked through the crack. The hallway was empty again, despite the intense sound still echoing. It was as if the shadows I had seen earlier were playing with me, surrounding me, but never fully revealing themselves. I slammed the door shut, trying to block out the noises and the fear that was consuming me from within. But as soon as I did, the knocking at the window returned, more persistent, more threatening. I turned back to the window, and this time, I knew I couldn't ignore it. With a mix of terror and resignation, I opened the curtain in one swift motion, expecting to find something horrible on the other side. But what I saw was even more disturbing. There was no one there, just the reflection of the violent storm shaking the world outside. The trees swayed violently, and the wind howled as if trying to tear down the motel. But then, in the middle of the darkness, I saw something. A figure, standing next to one of the cars in the parking lot. It was still, watching me. I slammed the curtain shut, my heart racing. Who was that person? And why were they out there, in the middle of a storm, without even trying to take shelter? Everything inside me screamed to leave that place immediately, but at the same time, something held me there, as if that figure wanted to keep me in this spiral of fear and uncertainty. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to leave, but I also knew that escaping wouldn't be easy. The figure in the parking lot still haunted me, even with the curtains closed. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation, but the fear was too great. I needed to get out of that room, and fast. I grabbed my things with trembling hands and decided it would be best to go to the reception to see if the strange receptionist was still there. Maybe, somehow, he could explain what was happening, or at least help me get out of there. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and opened the door to the room. The hallway was empty, but the strange noises persisted. The footsteps that had been running around me had stopped, but now a thick silence filled the place. The feeling that something was watching me didn't diminish. In fact, it seemed more intense with every step I took. I walked down the hallway toward the reception, hoping to find someone, anyone. But when I got there, the place was completely deserted. I looked around, calling for the receptionist. There was no answer. The bell on the front door was gently swaying, ringing softly in an eerie way. The desk was abandoned, and the lights flickered intermittently, creating an even more sinister atmosphere. It was as if the entire motel was under some sort of spell, where time had stopped and I was the only one there, trapped between the old, decaying walls of that place. I ran to the main entrance, trying to open it, but the glass door was locked. I started searching for keys, thinking maybe the receptionist had left them lying around. However, my search was useless. The only thing I found was a closed sign thrown on the desk. It was as if the entire motel was closing in around me, suffocating. With no way out, I was overcome with a wave of despair as I realized there was no escape. The figure I had seen outside continued to haunt me, and I knew I had to try another way out. I ran back through the hallway, trying to find another door or window that would lead me outside. But with every turn, the motel seemed to grow larger, as if the hallways were multiplying and the exits were hiding from me. The storm outside seemed to mirror my panic. The sound of the rain and wind blended with my own fear, creating an atmosphere of complete desolation. And it was when I reached my room again that the final horror hit me. Someone, or something, was waiting for me inside. When I opened the door to the room, my entire body froze. There, in the corner of the opposite wall, a figure was standing. It was the same one I had seen in the parking lot, but now it was much closer. It was watching me silently, not moving, not making a sound. It was just there, as if it had been part of the room all along, waiting for me. The fear I felt was so paralyzing that I couldn't move. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and my legs trembled so much that I almost collapsed. The figure was shrouded in shadows, and its face was impossible to make out. All I could see was the silhouette, which seemed to envelop me with its gaze. Finally, I gathered the strength to take a step back, but the moment I tried to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a loud click, as if it had been locked from the inside. Now I was trapped there, with that thing, and there was nowhere to run. The sound of the rain and thunder almost disappeared, and all that remained was the deep silence and the sound of my own labored breathing. Suddenly, the figure moved, slowly, toward me. Each of its steps was like a blow to my chest, and the terror engulfed me completely. My entire body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. As it came closer, an intense cold filled the room, as if all the heat had been sucked out of the air. At that moment, I knew. That thing wasn't human. It was something beyond our understanding. In a final moment of desperation, I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The room was empty, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know if it was real or just a product of my imagination, but I didn't want to wait to find out. I ran to the door, and this time, it opened easily. I rushed out of the room, feeling the cool air of the storm hit my face, bringing temporary relief. I threw my things into the car, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. As I drove down the soaked road, I looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing again at the window of my room, watching me, motionless, as I drove away. My whole body shuddered. That place, that thing, was still there. And somehow, I knew it would continue to follow me, in my thoughts, in my nightmares. What happened that night was a mystery that would never be solved.